On June 9, 2013, Cheryl and Leon Fairchild and Sherry and Steve Taylor from Dallas, and the Wichita, Kansas contingent, Annie and Lynn Kneller and Debbie and Chuck Sauer, headed for Copenhagen to begin the Baltic capital's cruise. The Fairchilds and Taylors made it without issues. However, the Wichita group's flight was delayed, causing a missed flight from Chicago, then delaying their arrival in Copenhagen by a full day. Shortly after arriving in Copenhagen, while Sherry, Leon, and Cheryl rested, Steve headed out on his own to wander the City Hall Square directly across the street from one of the Tivoli Garden gates. Bound on the west by the City Hall Square, the central town square by Copenhagen City Hall, and on the east by the New King's Square, another large square. But the Stroget area is actually a collection of streets that spread out from the central thoroughfare. Stroget was created in November 1962, when cars were beginning to dominate Copenhagen's old central streets. During the 1950s, the street was closed to traffic for a couple of days at Christmas. In 1962, the closure was half disguised as an extended holiday closure, but the road has remained closed since. The idea was controversial, some people believing that the Danes did not have the mentality for public life envisioned by such a street, and many local merchants believed the move would scare away business. However, it proved a success, and the area soon boasted more shoppers, cafes, and a renewed street life. Building on Stroget's success, the network expanded piecemeal. Another street and a few more squares were emptied of cars in 1968, and further closures took place in 1973, 1980, and 1992. From the initial 15,800 square meters of the Stroget Copenhagen's pedestrian network has expanded to about 100,000 square meters. Wandering off onto side streets when a tall tower might catch his eye, Steve got shots of various streets and buildings of interest, as well as the locals enjoying their pleasant weather. He made it all the way past the Copenhagen Opera House to Nyhavn, the maritime area of Copenhagen. Dug by Swedish war prisoners from the Dano-Swedish War from 1658 to 1660. It is a gateway from the sea to the old inner city at King's Square, where ships handled cargo and fishermen's catches. It was notorious for beer, sailors, and prostitution. Steve made his way back to the hotel near Tivoli Gardens to meet Sherry, Cheryl, and Leon, to head out to the city square to wait for the arrival of the Wichita group, not knowing they'd been delayed a day. Sherry and Cheryl amused themselves with the Hans Christian Andersen statue. A fine Danish dinner was enjoyed at the Kentucky Fried Chicken on the square. After dinner, Sherry and Steve headed back to Stroget for an after-dinner walk, finding a wall with dangling circles where Sherry decided to immortalize their grandson, Caden. Monday morning, Cheryl, Leon, Sherry, and Steve, having learned that the others were delayed, headed to the terminal to catch a tour bus to castles and palaces around Copenhagen, barely making it to the terminal before the bus left, as they'd been in the wrong spot waiting for the bus. A short stop in Hommelbæk provided an opportunity to photograph the thatched roofs of the village. The tour headed for North Zealand to the town of Elsinore, the location of Kronborg Castle. William Shakespeare had visited the castle, and his time at the castle inspired him to base his play Hamlet on this castle. One of the most important Renaissance castles in northern Europe, Kronborg sits at Denmark's northern tip, a mere 2.5 miles across the water from what once was arch-enemy Sweden. Kronborg's main yard, just beyond the mullion windows, is huge, befitting the grandeur of the castle, which burned down in 1629 and was quickly rebuilt. Leon chatted with some other tour participants who didn't want to trek through the castle, while Cheryl, Sherry, and Steve participated in the tour. The guide on this tour repeatedly noted the very short distance to Sweden across the stretch of water by the castle, and said many of the artifacts from the castle that we would like to see were stolen by the Swedes in various incursions into Denmark. Even so, there were many fine tapestries, paintings, and furnishings to view as the guide led the tour through the castle compartments. The chapel in the castle had elaborate pews and ceiling carvings. There was also an ornate pulpit and pipe organ. For those that wanted to follow along, the guide led a tour down into the dungeon of the castle. The next stop on the day's tour was Fredensborg Palace, the Danish royal family's spring and autumn residence, which is routinely used for important state visits. The French-inspired Baroque palace was built from 1720 to 1726 at the request of King Friedrich IV. The guards at Fredensborg wear the bare fur hats similar to those of the British Royal Guards. At the next stop, while Cheryl, Sherry, and Leon enjoyed a lunch of pizza at a local shop, Steve hiked around Frederiksborg Castle, built by King Christian IV between 1601 and 1625. This pearl of history, built in magnificent Renaissance style with a touch of Baroque, is now a National Historical Museum containing treasures of painting, tapestry, porcelain, silver, and furniture. After Christian IV's death in 1648, the palace was used mainly for ceremonial events. It was the scene of many royal anointments. The church has also been used as the Knights' Chapel for the Order of the Elephant and the Order of Dannebrog since 1693. It housed the Danish royal family's art collection, notably works on the life of Jesus by Danish painter Carl Heinrich Bloch, and was the site of the 1720 Treaty of Frederiksborg. In the 1850s, the palace was again used as a residence by King Frederick VII. While he was in residence on the evening of December 16, 1859, a fire destroyed a large part of the main palace's interior. Reconstruction was funded by public subscription with large contributions from the king and state, as well as the prominent philanthropist J.C. Jacobsen of Carlsberg Brewery. Jacobsen also funded the Museum of Natural History that now occupies Frederiksborg. Much to the chagrin of the Danish people, in one of the replacement paintings, the image of Jakobsen is used to represent a historical figure. The Palace Church, or Chapel of Orders, serves as a local church today and is part of the museum on the premises. The coat of arms of recipients of the Order of the Elephant and of the Dannebrog are displayed on the walls of the church, including Dwight Eisenhower. The guide told the group a story about a king and a queen, where the king was sickly, and the queen and the doctor looking after the king had an affair and pretty much ran the kingdom. A recent movie was made about this named A Royal Affair. On the tour, the guide informed the group that all the kings of Denmark were either named Christian or Friedrich. However, Denmark's head of state is currently Queen Margrethe II. While the tour was heading back to Copenhagen, the Wichita folks had finally arrived. Communication via the hotel switchboards was not working, so Sherry, Cheryl, and Steve headed out to dinner and were surprised to find Chuck and Lynn sitting on a bench in front of their hotel office. Annie and Debbie were in the lobby trying to get a message to the Dallas group. The group walked to a local restaurant for dinner, and afterwards, all but Chuck and Steve headed back to their respective hotels. Chuck and Steve headed back to the Stroget, walking down to Nuon at dusk. Steve and Chuck walked north to find the Citadel and a windmill. While walking through the Citadel, the lowering of the flag ceremony occurred at sunset, and sunset was marked by the firing of a cannon. Heading back to the center of town, the Anglican church's reflection made for a good photo. Steve passed the gates of the Tivoli Gardens on his way back to the hotel. Wednesday morning, the entire group made their way to the port to board the Norwegian Star and begin the cruise. Overnight, the ship cruised north from Copenhagen around the Zealand Island and then down to the Baltic Sea, arriving the next morning in Warnemund, Germany, near Rostock. The morning was misty as the group headed for the train station. They boarded a train with compartments for 6. There were 8 in the group, so Cheryl and Leon got to sit in a compartment with some Asians that spoke very little English. The trip to Berlin was 3 hours long, and the scenery out of the windows was less than exciting, so there was a lot of conversation and a lot of catching up on old times. After a while, it was all too much for some in the group, so they decided to zone out. Finally, the train pulled into the station in Berlin. Then the group boarded a bus for a tour of the city of Berlin. The first stop was at the Brandenburg Gate. This was the spot where Ronald Reagan told Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. More travel on the bus delivered the tour to the Reichstag building. After a couple of stops, the tour proceeded down the main boulevard, past statues and monuments. A buffet lunch of traditional German food was provided on the tour at the Lohnbrau restaurant. Then it was back on the bus for the next stop at Checkpoint Charlie, the Cold War gate between East and West Germany. The next stop was at the Holocaust Memorial. Long aisles between concrete slabs. Hitler's bunker was located just across the street, but it has been destroyed to assure there is no martyrdom for him. A stop at the German version of the White House was provided for those wanting to take photographs. The tour traveled past the Tower of Triumph, but no one in the group could recall when Germany triumphed, so they weren't sure what it was celebrating, but it was very impressive. Charlottenburg was the next stop. As impressive as it was from the front, the only vantage point available to the group, it was vastly more impressive from photos of the back later found on the internet. All on the bus tour were provided free time to peruse shops along a boulevard. Steve spent his time trying to get some interesting photos of flowers. The final stop in Berlin was at the Berlin Wall, where artists have painted murals that adorn long stretches of the old wall. Finally, all boarded the train for the 3-hour trip back to the ship. and the misty rain. There was a full day at sea for the group before the ship arrived in Tallinn, Estonia. Sherry, Cheryl, Leon, Annie, and Lynn took a walking tour of the old city of Tallinn. They enjoyed the local environment and partook of the local libations. Annie and Lynn actually walked back to the ship after the tour and found it to be just a little bit further than they'd anticipated. Chuck and Debbie took an all-day tour that drove through Kudroig Park by the Kudroig Palace, Catherine's Palace, a patrine Baroque palace built for Catherine I of Russia by Peter the Great. The tour drove by Pirita, a yachting complex for the 1980 Olympic rowing events. The tour headed into the center of Tallinn, beginning at the tall Herman Tower to begin the walk along Tallinn's medieval cobblestone streets, past the Russian Orthodox Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, past the Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church, and proceeded to the scenic viewpoint over the lower town rooftops. After lunch at a restaurant at the city square, the tour proceeded to a concert of medieval music at St. Nicholas Church, after which there was leisure time to wander the streets before heading back to the ship. Steve took an all-day tour that went outside Tallinn's metropolitan area through the countryside to the town of Rakvere, home to a medieval castle. Before heading to the castle, the tour group visited a home that is decorated as it would have been near the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Outside the home, there were old buildings with interesting doors, and one could see a windmill on top of the hill. Artifacts from around the area date civilization in this area back to the 3rd century. When the Danish king sold Danish Estonia to the Livonian order in 1346, a large castle was built on top of the previous stronghold. The remains of the castle are presented for tours. Period characters were available to entertain the tour participants, and activities such as archery were available. A tour of the dungeon resulted in Steve meeting a young lady, Sagan Blackwell, a graduate student from South Carolina, who latched onto his arm when they shut off all the lights in the dungeon, making it pitch dark. At noon, the cannon is fired. It turned out that a wedding was taking place during the time the tour was occurring at the castle. The person performing the wedding ceremony was dressed as a medieval monk. Lunch was provided and Steve was given what was called root beer. He wasn't sure how long the plant had been dead when the root was dug up, but the taste was not like A&W. Shots of vodka were also available. Steve had seen a field of grass next to the castle with paths and decided to walk to the end of the field to take some photos back toward the castle. Rockvear is also known now for its Tarva statue of an aurochs. It is thought to be the largest animal statue in the Baltic countries. It is situated on the edge of Valamigi Hill and was erected for the town's 700th birthday. Along with the granite block it sits on, the statue is 7 meters long and 4 meters high and weighs about 7 tons. Steve's tour then headed back into Tallinn to also begin the walking tour near the tower, past the Nevsky Cathedral, past the Lutheran church. A wedding had just concluded at the Lutheran church and Steve got some shots of the bride and groom. After the guide led the tour to the scenic overlook of the roofs of the lower town, the participants were free to wander the cobblestone streets at their leisure. The tour participants congregated back at the Nevsky Cathedral where Sagan and Steve posed for a photo. Finally, everyone was back at the port, where Chuck got a photo of what he considered a shady character preparing to board the ship. Overnight, the Norwegian star headed for St. Petersburg, Russia. Until the early 1700s, the area that is now St. Petersburg was a swampy land fed by the Neva River heading into the Gulf of Finland.
Up to that time, Russia had been a landlocked country on the European side.
Peter the Great wanted a seaport on the Baltic and won the area in a battle with the Swedes. He had visited European cities and realized how backward Russia was, so he dragged the elite of Russia, kicking and screaming, to this marsh area to establish the new capital of Russia, and it remained the capital until 1918, when the Bolsheviks overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. Annie, Lynn, Debbie, Chuck, and Steve headed out for an all-day tour. The tour bus wound its way over the canals and through the streets of St. Petersburg on the way to Pushkin and the Catherine Palace. A gift from Peter the Great to his second wife, Catherine, who had been a campmaid he'd fallen in love with during the war with the Swedes. The palace was yet to be complete when Peter died, so Catherine actually spent very little time at the palace. Peter and Catherine's daughter Elizabeth presided over the completion of the palace. The palace is popularly associated with Catherine the Great, but she actually regarded its whipped cream architecture as old-fashioned. The house has been pulled down 6 times to the foundation, then built up again till it was brought to its present state. At the time, the sum of 1,600,000 rubles was spent on the construction. Upon Catherine the Great's death in 1796, the palace was abandoned in favor of the Pavlovsk Palace. Subsequent monarchs preferred to reside in the nearby Alexander Palace, and with only 2 exceptions, refrained from making new additions to the Catherine Palace, regarding it as a splendid monument to Elizabeth's wealth and Catherine II's glory. In 1817, Alexander I engaged Vasily Stasov to refurbish some interiors of his grandmother's residence in the Empire style. 20 years later, the magnificent Stasov staircase was constructed to replace the old circular staircase leading to the palace chapel. Unfortunately, most of Stasov's interiors, specifically those dating from the reign of Nicholas I, have not been restored after the destruction caused by the Germans during World War II. After the tour, the interior, the group was led through the gardens at the rear of the palace and then to the servants' quarters for lunch, after which the tour group made use of free time for photo opportunities. The tour then headed back to St. Petersburg.
A stop was provided near the canals in front of the Maritime Cathedral with its gold-domed bell tower and 5 gold domes on the cathedral. Free time was given to shop or stroll about the area. As seemed to be the norm for this trip, a wedding had taken place in the cathedral.
The tour's next stop was the Winter Palace and the Hermitage, which now houses a vast art museum. The museum displays some of the world's finest art treasures. Only a small portion of the collections are on display at any one time. The tour wandered through the various areas of the museum for what seemed like hours. Back outside the Hermitage, the tour group boarded the bus and headed back to the port to the ship for the night. Meanwhile, Cheryl, Leon, and Sherry had taken a half-day tour that included a boat tour through the canals of St. Petersburg. Sherry and Cheryl sampled the vodka. The next stop was the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood. This church was built on the site where Tsar Alexander II was assassinated and was dedicated in his memory. It should not be confused with the Church on Blood in honor of All Saints Resplendent in the Russian land, located in the city of Yekaterinburg, where the former Emperor Nicholas II, 1868 to 1918, and several members of his family and household were executed following the Bolshevik Revolution. On March 13, 1881, as Tsar Alexander's carriage passed along the embankment, a grenade thrown by an anarchist conspirator exploded. The Tsar, shaken but unhurt, got out of the carriage and started to remonstrate with the presumed culprit. A second conspirator took the chance to throw another bomb, killing himself and mortally wounding the Tsar. The Tsar, bleeding heavily, was taken back to the Winter Palace, where he died a few hours later. A temporary shrine was erected on the site of the attack, while plans and fundraising for a more permanent memorial were undertaken. In order to build a permanent shrine on the exact spot where the assassination took place, it was decided to narrow the canal so that the section of road on which the Tsar had been driving could be included within the walls of the church. An elaborate shrine was constructed at the end of the church opposite the altar, on the exact place of Alexander's death. Back on the ship, the entire group met for dinner in the main dining room. The following morning, Sherry, Cheryl, and Leon took a half-day tour that went to Catherine's palace. Their tour left earlier than the others, so Steve was able to get a video of them leaving the ship and heading into the Russian Customs Center. Arriving in Pushkin, Sherry, Cheryl, and Leon were greeted by the street musicians before the tour heading into the palace. They saw most of the things that the others in the group had seen the prior day. Sherry was pleased that her footies matched her Louis Vuitton bag. When the German forces retreated after the siege of Leningrad, they intentionally destroyed the residence, leaving only the hollow shell of the palace behind. Prior to World War II, the Russian archivists managed to document a fair amount of the interior, which proved of great importance in reconstructing the palace. Although the largest part of reconstruction was completed in time for the tercentenary of St. Petersburg in 2003, much work is still required to restore the palace to its former glory. In order to attract funds, the palace's administration has leased the Grand Hall for such high-profile events as Elton John's concert for an elite audience in 2001 and an exclusive party in 2005 featuring the likes of Bill Clinton, Tina Turner, Whitney Houston, Naomi Campbell, and Sting. The tour headed back to the ship after the palace tour. Annie, Lynn, Debbie, Chuck, and Steve took a tour that headed for Peterhof, the city of palaces. They again traveled over the canals and along the streets to leave the city behind. They passed the Russian Orthodox Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul, which is just outside the grounds of the palace. A bit of free time was allotted to walk the gardens, while the guide purchased tickets, so Chuck and Steve spent some time taking photos of the exterior and garden.
No photos were allowed inside the palace, so video captured from the DVD St. Petersburg, Palaces of the Tsars has been used to present some of the interior for this video.
After a much-needed opportunity to use the restrooms, 2 hours after the group was told they'd be given time, the tour headed out to the gardens that led to the Baltic Sea. The area of the palace has appeared in many magazine advertisements. The Grand Cascade is modeled on one constructed for Louis XIV at his Château de Marly, which is likewise memorialized in one of the park's outbuildings. The fountains of the Grand Cascade are located below the grotto and on either side of it. Their waters flow in a semicircular pool, the terminus of the fountain-lined sea channel. In the 1730s, the large Samson fountain was placed in this pool. It depicts the moment when Samson tears open the jaws of a lion, representing Russia's victory over Sweden in the Great Northern War, and is doubly symbolic. The lion is an element of the Swedish coat of arms, and one of the great victories of the war was won on St. Samson's Day. From the lion's mouth shoots a 20-meter-high vertical jet of water, the highest in all of Peterhof. The masterpiece by Michel Kozlowski was looted by invading Germans during the Second World War. A replica of the statue was installed in 1947. Perhaps the greatest technological achievement of Peterhof is that all of the fountains operate without the use of pumps. Water is supplied from natural springs and collects in reservoirs in the upper gardens. The elevation difference creates the pressure that drives most of the fountains of the lower gardens, including the Grand Cascade. The Samson Fountain is supplied by a special aqueduct over 4 kilometers in length, drawing water and pressure from a high elevation source. Peterhof, like Catherine's Palace, was captured by German troops in 1941 and held until 1944. In the few months that lapsed between the outbreak of war in the West and the appearance of the German army, employees were only able to save a portion of the treasures of the palaces and fountains. An attempt was made to dismantle and bury the fountain sculptures, but 3/4, including all the largest ones, remained in place. The occupying forces of the German army largely destroyed Peterhof. Many of the fountains were destroyed, and the palace was partially exploded and left to burn. Restoration work began almost immediately after the war and continues to this day. Lunch was provided in what was at one time the kitchens of the palace. This is located in what is now called Alexandria Park. The park has fountains and gold-gilded statues. As the group walked toward the waiting hydrofoil, a sudden downpour forced 10 times more people into the snack shop than it was designed to hold. After the rain passed, the tour group boarded the hydrofoil for the trip back into St. Petersburg by water. Meeting the tour bus on the shore of the Neva River, the tour headed for the fortress of Peter and Paul, which includes the cathedral of the same name. Peter the Great had his only son imprisoned in the fortress and eventually executed for suspected plot to overthrow Peter. The cathedral is dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul, the patron saints of the fortress, Saint Peter being the patron saint of the city. The current cathedral is the second one on the site. The first was built soon after Peter's founding of the city. The current building, the first stone church in St. Petersburg, was built between 1712 and 1733. Its golden spire reaches a height of 404 feet and features an angel holding a cross at the top. The angel is one of the most important symbols of St. Petersburg. The cathedral houses the remains of all but 2 of the Russian emperors and empresses, from Peter the Great to Nicholas II and his family, who were finally laid to rest in July 1998 in a room by themselves. Also buried here was Catherine the Great, the empress who ruled Russia for 34 years. After leaving the fortress and waiting for the arrival of the bus, the tour participants saw the military museum across the way and snapped some photos of the cannons and other military equipment. A short trip back along the banks of the Neva River and then across the bridge, the group arrived for a short stop at the Church of the Spilled Blood. There wasn't time to go into the church, but photos were taken outside. Back aboard the ship, the cruise continued overnight to Helsinki, Finland. Sherry, Cheryl, and Leon took a half-day tour that included a boat trip through Helsinki Bay. Helsinki is built on a giant slab of granite that make the foundations very steady. A guide told the group that Helsinki was being pushed up out of the sea by the movement of the Earth's plates. So if one wanted to buy a small bit of rock peeking out of the sea, by the time their grandchildren inherited it, it might be an island fit for a house.
Annie and Lynn took a tour of the city that stopped at various locations. The first stop was Sibelius Park, which features an abstract art piece composed of more than 600 hollow steel pipes. There's also the face of Finnish composer Jan Sibelius. Their next stop was at the Temple Kaiku Church on the Rock, a Lutheran church in Turku neighborhood of Helsinki. Annie indicated that while their tour was at the church, it was very crowded and impossible to get around to see it all. Their next and final stop was at the Tumuro Kirkko, the white neoclassical Lutheran cathedral. Ship personnel were dressed as Vikings as Debbie, Chuck, and Steve headed out for their shore excursion. This tour began with a bus trip through the city past the locals enjoying the weather. The first stop on the tour was the Tumuro Kirkko Cathedral. It is situated on a hill and makes a strong impression. The 5 greenish domes, numerous Corinthian columns, and a number of statues on the roof are visible from the sea. When you come into town by ferry, it is a very prominent landmark. From the outside, the church is amazing, with the long stairs that go up to the gate and the really white color of the building. In front of the church, there is a big square, the Senate Square, with a big statue in the middle. Building of the church started in 1830 and was completed in 1852. The tour then headed out into the country along the coast, heading for the ancient town of Porvoo. Porvoo was first mentioned in documents as early as the 14th century. The town is famed for its Old Town, a dense medieval street pattern with predominantly wooden houses. However, not many of the houses seen on the tour appeared to be older than the 20th century, but the steep cobblestone streets could have been original. The central part of the old town is the medieval stone and brick Porvoo Cathedral. It was built in the 15th century, although the oldest parts date from the 13th century. The church was originally made of wood. The first stone walls were built between 1410 and 1420, and in about 1450, the church was expanded 4 meters to the east and 6 meters towards the south. Leaving the church, the tour headed down more cobblestone streets. Finally, the tour came to the shopping area and free time to shop was granted to the tour participants. Chuck and Debbie bought a Ruinberg tart at the Café Helmi to take back to Lynn. Rather than shop, Steve wandered the streets, taking photos. The bus then headed to the spa hotel Heiko for lunch and free time to enjoy the well-manicured gardens below the spa. As the bus was preparing to leave, Chuck spied a Rolls-Royce that looked like one he'd owned, in his dreams. The bus headed back into Helsinki, past the Olympic Stadium, arriving at the Sibelius Park, which Lynn and Annie had visited earlier. Chuck got a very interesting shot from below the pipes while Steve headed off to the harbor side to get some shots of the locals. Back on the bus, the tour headed to the Church in the Rock. This tour group was the only one at the church at this time, so it was not crowded at all. The interior of the church was excavated and built directly out of solid rock and is bathed in natural light which enters through the glazed dome. The church is used frequently as a concert venue due to its excellent acoustics. The acoustic quality is created by the rough, virtually unworked rock surfaces. The iconic rock walls were not included in the original design, even though the designers had considered the idea, because they believed that it was too radical for the design competition jury. But when conductor Pavel Berglund shared his knowledge of acoustics from some of the best music halls, and the acoustical engineer, Marie Praho, gave requirements of the wall surfaces to the designers, they discovered that they could fulfill all the requirements for the acoustics by leaving the rock walls exposed in the church hall. Shopping time was provided, and then it was back onto the bus and back to port. That evening's activities included bingo, drinks, and dinner, with a visit to the chocolate displays at what Steve called the trough. The ship headed for Stockholm overnight. At daylight, which was very early this far north, the ship wound its way through the thousands of islands with their very nice homes. Arriving in the Stockholm harbor, all in the group boarded a bus for a city tour. Heading through the city, the tour arrived at the Vasa Museum. The museum displays the only, almost fully intact 17th century ship that has ever been salvaged, the 64-gun warship Vasa that sank on her maiden voyage in 1628. Commissioned by the King Gustav II on Sunday, the 10th of August, 1628, Vasa lay rigged and ready for sea just below the royal palace, Tre Kronor. Ballast, guns, and ammunition were all on board. On the quays and shores, an excited public waited to watch the ship leave Stockholm and celebrate her departure. Over 100 crewmen were on board, as well as women and children. The crew had permission to take family and guests along for the first part of the passage through the archipelago. For the first few hundred meters, Vasa was warped along the waterfront with cables from the shore. The ship did not begin to sail until she reached what is now Slussen. Sailors climbed the rigging to set 4 of Vasa's 10 sails. A salute was fired, and Vasa slowly began her maiden voyage. Once Vasa came out from under the lee of the Soderman cliffs, the sails could catch the wind, but the ship was tender and heeled over to port, then heeled again even farther. Water rushed in through the open gun ports, and the ship's fate was decided. Vasa sank after sailing barely 1,300 meters. The crew threw themselves into the water or clung to the rigging until rescued, but not all managed to save themselves. Eyewitnesses differ on the exact numbers, but perhaps 30 of the approximately 150 people on board died in the loss. After the ship was raised in 1961, the remains of at least 16 people were found. Divers found the ship in 1956, and after 330 years at the bottom of the sea, at 9:03 a.m. on the 24th of April, 1961, Vasa returned to the surface. Restoration ensued, and the ship is now housed at the Vasa Museum. 90% of the wood on the ship is original. The masts had to be replaced as they'd been broken off by fishing nets over the centuries. Leaving the museum, the bus headed through Stockholm. A brief stop for photos of a scenic view of the town was provided. The next stop was Sweden's Royal Palace area, where free time was provided to the tour participants for shopping or lunch. Steve wandered the streets, taking photos of the streets and the locals enjoying the midday. All arrived back at the designated gathering place to catch the bus. A lively game of lawn bowling was taking place while the group waited for the bus. After more driving through the streets, the tour arrived at the Ice Hotel for a visit to the ice bar. Parkas and drinks were provided to the guests for the short stay in the frigid bar. The tour headed back to the port to be greeted by the ship's staff doing some sort of dance routine. The group settled in at the bar for some relaxation and discussions. The remainder of the cruise was at sea for the final day. This day was spent relaxing and reflecting on the trip. The entire group met for the final dinner and had their picture taken on the staircase. The ship arrived in Copenhagen on Friday morning and all headed back to the U.S. The next stop on the day's tour was Fredensborg Palace, the Danish royal family's spring and autumn residence.